Bonjour YouTube, welcome back to our channel. Today we're in Saint-Denis and we'll be taking you to Museum of Art and History of Saint-Denis. On y va! Today we find ourselves in the city of Saint-Denis, that is right at the gates of Paris. Or precisely, we're at the Paul Éluard Museum of Art and History, a cultural jewel nestled in an old 17th century convent. Originally, this building was a Carmelite convent built in 1625. It is this place that would later become the home of Madame Louise de France, the youngest child of Louis XV. There is still the cloister, the nuns' cells, and a magnificent neoclassical chapel, which we'll visit in a bit. The whole complex was under a threat of being demolished in the mid-20th century. However, thanks to the local council and the residents, it was saved with the development project in agreement with the Direction des Musées de France. The new museum opened in 1981 and today welcomes visitors with its permanent and temporary collections. The permanent collections of this museum tell the story of Saint-Denis from its medieval times to the present day.
Here, you discover archaeological remains from the excavation works around the basilica that is nearby.
By the way, we've done an in-depth visit of the Basilica Cathedral of Saint-Denis. We've left the link in the first comment of this video in case you haven't watched it yet.
The museum also preserves one of the most beautiful old pharmacies in France. Hundreds of pots, vials and medical instruments tell the story of the Hôtel Dieu. We, however, have come here specifically to visit the room of the daughter of Louis XV, Madame Louise. In our previous episode, we discovered the apartments of Madame at the Château de Versailles. The king and the Queen Marie Lezinska had 8 daughters, with the youngest being Madame Louise, born on July 15, 1737. Her birth was not really celebrated at court. By then, royal daughters were viewed as burdens rather than blessings. Only one of them got eventually married off, so the rest remained at the palace.
The budget was strained by the expenses of Versailles, and the government was under growing pressure to reduce costs. Raising so many princesses required an enormous retinue of governesses, tutors, maids, and provisions. In an act both practical and cruel, Louis XV decided to send his youngest daughters, including Louise, away. At just 3 years old, she was removed from Versailles and sent to the Abbey of Fontevraud, hundreds of kilometers from the court. The official reason? A pious religious education. The real reason? Cost-cutting and political convenience.
Madame Campan, who read for the Madame and would later become lady-in-waiting to Queen Marie Antoinette, recounts that the decision caused deep resentment and emotional trauma. Louise and her sisters were lodged in the cold halls of the abbey under the supervision of nuns who showed them little maternal warmth.
Campan described a particularly haunting episode that the girls never forgot. They were made to say their prayers in a chapel beside the room of a man who was likely dying from rabies. His tortured screams echoed through the stone walls as the little girls whispered Latin verses they scarcely understood. You get the picture. This was not a typical royal upbringing, and worse, there was also an intellectual neglect. When the girls returned back to Versailles, their education was, to put it nicely, lacking. Madame Campan noted that Louise hadn't even finished learning the alphabet. The princesses were behind not only in letters, but in manners, confidence, and courtly behavior.
However, the girls were eager to learn and spent endless hours on improving their education, manners, and etiquette. Louise was particularly eager to catch up and had Madame Campan read for her up to 5 hours a day. To ease the strain on her voice, Madame Louise would often give Madame Campan warm water with sugar. On one of such days in 1770, during a typically long reading session, Madame Louise was called to a different office and promptly left. Upon her return, she showed no signs of any changes and asked Madame Campan to continue to read. The next morning, on April 11, 1770, the princess left for the Carmelite convent of Saint-Denis, where we are today, and took the name Thérèse de Saint-Augustin. Only the king knew of Madame Louise's project and eventually gave her his blessing the day prior.
The remaining sisters, Adélaïde, Victoire, and Sophie, were deeply affected by this move, but showed appreciation and respect for their sister's decision. She left behind satin gowns, gold jewelry, royal coaches, and began sweeping floors, washing linens, and praying before dawn. She slept on straw, walked barefoot, and fasted regularly. Madame Campan would later recall one of her visits to the convent to see the daughter of the king. She found her to be more serene than she had ever been at the palace. Louise saw her vocation as a means of atonement for what she believed to be the sins of her family and the decadence of the monarchy. Her prayers, said Madame Campan, were for the salvation of France. She also wrote to bishops and even the Pope, warning of the spiritual danger that loomed over France. Louise believed that the soul of the kingdom was in peril, and she offered her own sufferings as a kind of living sacrifice.
By 1787, Louise began to suffer from frequent illnesses. After all, her health was known to be delicate. On December 23, 1787, she died, whispering, "Let us hasten to paradise." She was 50 years old. The official cause of death was illness, natural and expected, but another theory circulated quietly within the convent walls.
A mysterious package said to contain relics had arrived not long before her final illness. When it was opened, a strange smoke or vapor escaped. The prioress fell ill shortly after. Some suspected poison, a deliberate act to silence a woman whose influence still reached the court. No proof was ever found, and physicians declared her death natural. But the timing and the swiftness of her decline left many in doubt. She was buried at the cemetery of the Carmelites. During the revolution, the convent was closed and desecrated. And when the royal necropolis was desecrated too, the revolutionaries apparently remembered the princess's grave was just a few minutes away from the basilica and desecrated her grave, throwing her remains into the common pit along with other royals. For many, Madame Louise represents inner nobility, not through birth, but through her sacrifice and dedication.
And finally, on the upper floor of the museum, we found ourselves in the rooms dedicated to La Commune, an event that completely shook the country, especially Paris. Rare and captivating objects as well as visual documentation are presented here. Thanks to its proximity to Paris, Saint-Denis was and is still deeply affected by the significant events and changes in the capital. To finish this visit, we passed by neoclassical Chapel Notre-Dame-du-Mont-Carmel that today is used as an exhibition space. Built by the architect of the king, Richard Mink, who is notably known for his creation of the gardens and Marie Antoinette's Amo at Petit Trianon.
It is said that Madame Louise was the driving force behind this project, along with Louis XVI, whose donations financed the construction. The Carmelites occupied this place until their departure in 1895. As a result, the chapel was converted into a local tribunal, hence the inscription Justice of Peace above the entrance. The architecture is a jewel, hidden in the hustle and bustle of the surrounding city. The most shocking thing for me was to literally see this little cell that Madame Louise was living in. Imagine quitting Versailles and then the court of Versailles and live here. It doesn't even get into my mind. And plus, Sinan was really freaked out today because when we were there was some creaky sound that happened several times. Even after we looked at each other, it happened again from the door as if it moved by itself. So Sinan is kind of afraid of that place. He said it was bad energy, so now we're gonna leave.
I don't know, I also heard some weird noises. I don't know, I don't know.
We cannot stress enough how strange this whole place feels. Sinan said he felt some sort of a negative energy. I, on the other hand, felt like the museum opens the door into Saint-Denis we don't see so often these days. It is hidden, it is quiet, but it's still there, present and significant.